just wanted to welcome you, Martha, to our session, and welcome Alice Jennings as well.
Hello.
We're very excited
Hey, Alice.
to hear about this new dimension that I think is going to be increasingly important with climate change, with the whole issue of equity throughout government operations, and such fundamental things as clean water and clean air, and all aspects of sort of the basic needs being met as people struggle to simply have those things that I think so many take for granted. So I think we're very lucky to have you, and I appreciate the work you do as well as leading the lawyers around bringing human rights home. And want to thank Alice Jennings as well for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll go ahead and get started. We're excited to have the whole group, which we weren't expecting. So, but having said that, it may create some technical challenges, which I'm sure that Javier will take care of. I just a moment ago, Javier, sharing my screen, and it said that if I did that your computer sound sharing would end. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm going to be wanting to share my screen, not immediately, but eventually. So we'll be able to work that out. So I'm Martha Davis. I'm a professor at Northeastern University School of Law, as Robin said, and my research focuses on United States human rights issues, particularly economic and social rights such as water and housing. So I'm delighted that we were able to follow the plenary session that just ended up here, which is so related to what Alice and I are going to be speaking about. So I'm chairing this two-person panel, and I'm excited to introduce, to give a formal introduction to my partner on the panel, Alice Jennings. Alice, for those who don't know of her, is really a legendary civil rights lawyer, but she's not simply a legend. She's really very active today and working on issues of water access and environmental justice, among others. She's the co-founder of the Michigan law firm Edwards and Jennings. And to this panel, in 2014, Alice became part of the leadership of the legal team that filed a constitutional challenge to the irreparable harm caused to Detroiters when the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department shut off water to tens of thousands of individuals. And people may remember the trauma around that issue back in 2014 and then after as well. As a result of the lawsuit, Detroit changed its shutoff procedures and established thousands of water service repayment plans. And Alice is currently involved in two additional water and environmental cases. One, Taylor versus Whitmer, challenges the fundamental issue of water unaffordability and water shutoffs in Detroit. And then Alice's firm recently filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of residents of the city of Benton Harbor, based on violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The city did not advise residents to stop ingesting the water, even though they knew of these violations. So I think we'll all be looking forward to Alice's thoughts about how local government can do better. I think one of the messages that we want to impart today is the idea that water really is a civil rights issue. And I think it's been in the shadows for quite a while. I mean, I noted in the discussion of the Fair Housing Act and housing issues generally that I was part of the past half hour or so, that water wasn't really mentioned, even though it is covered by the Fair Housing Act. So one of the things we want to really bring home today is that we hope that human rights commissions and civil rights commissions will view water affordability and access and quality as being one of the things that they should be cognizant of, as well as all the other issues that are on their plate. So before we launch into our own remarks, we wanted to try to get a sense of what people's experiences are in your communities with water justice and environmental issues. And we have several questions, and Javier was going to run these for us. We practiced in the breakout, so hopefully it'll work here. Okay, great. So, and Javier, do you have instructions for people, or are we now?
So people can go to menti.com and use 1604 1762 and answer those questions. And then as they're ready, we can navigate to the other two.
Could you put that in the chat, please?
So it's menti.com. You can use your browser and your laptop or your mobile phone or your tablet. And the code is right there. And whenever you're ready, I can pass to the other questions.
Okay, well, we'll wait a minute so people can get set up here. And I can see there are 158 people on the call, so we only have a tiny fraction right now, so we'll wait a little bit. Here, we've got a vote coming in the chat, which is circumventing all the Mentimeter stuff. Thank you, folks.
You ready, babe? Okay.
So we've got a couple more no's than are registered here and a couple more yeses. But it looks as if, you know, the majority of people are seeing this kind of thing in their communities, but, you know, maybe more people than I would have thought are not seeing this. So I don't want to rush people, but let's, we can go ahead and maybe move to the next poll, Javier.
Absolutely. So we're using the same URL and the same code.
So of course, you know, I'm very interested to see this result coming in since, you know, for so many years, for so many decades, really, there wasn't very much attention to water prices as being the least expensive of the utilities that people were having to handle. And, you know, as I'm sure that many people are aware, water prices have risen dramatically in recent years. And so it's become much more of an issue for everyone, but especially for low income people who are already on the edge of making ends meet. And then, of course, you know, COVID just accentuated some of these problems that people were experiencing. Okay, it seems like that has stabilized here. So let's look at our third question then. Well, I think this is pretty interesting, that it looks like only a very small number of your commissions are really looking at this through a racial lens. And so that's one of the reasons we're happy to have this panel, is that we hope that we'll start to give you some ideas and some tools to start seeing what the racial impacts of this phenomena are. Great. So when we open it up for questions and discussion, I'd love to hear from some of the folks that have answered here, people that have said yes, you know, I'm very curious about what communities those are and what you've done, and then the people that said no, whether you've considered it or sort of aware of it and just haven't had a chance to address it with all the other things that you're looking at. So thank you very much for the poll. Thank you, Javier, for working that for me, who's technically challenged. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alice to talk about the water and related health and housing issues that she's been addressing in Michigan. And that will get us started thinking about the role that human rights commissions might play in addressing racial and environmental justice issues. So Alice, let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Martha Davis. I'm honored to be on this panel today with you. And we've been working together now. It's been several years since 2014. I'd like to thank Robin Thoma as well and the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. I'm just so pleased and proud to be here. There are a lot of people I'd like to thank for this work that we've been doing out of Detroit. Certainly the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization and the People's Water Board Organization. There have been a team of lawyers across the country, including I am an affiliate with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Eiffel, Janaea Nelson, Monique Lynn Luce. All of those lawyers have been working with Detroiters and Detroit lawyers to help craft what has become a movement of litigation on this issue of water. And water is a human right. I mean, we've got to absolutely know that as we fight, water is now the new gold. It is going to be an issue in the coming term of this country and this world that is going to be definitive in so many areas, and particularly where there's drought across the nation and across the world. I would just say that my work in this field began some years ago. And please pardon the phone, I should have taken it off. That's the landline. So that's old-fashioned kind of thing that a lot of us don't have anymore, but we still have one. So bear with me. The case of Detroit was so profound and so intense. I mean, I live in Detroit. And then suddenly to have your neighbors have their water cut off. We have a truck from the Homrich Wrecking Company going up and down the streets and literally turning off the water for 70% of the neighbors. We had approximately 40,000 homes shut off for water. We're talking about children, we're talking about seniors, we're talking about people with disabilities, we're talking about pregnant women. We're talking about folks who had no money to go pay and get their bills connected. And those 40,000 or so plaintiffs literally became organized under the auspices of both the People's Water Board as well as Michigan Welfare Rights into 2 national and international summits. And what we found was that the crises in water delivery, affordability, the safeness of water was not just happening in Detroit. Indeed, it was happening across the United States. And when we held the summit in Detroit, we found it was happening across the world. We had folks coming from France, from Italy, from Mexico that were saying the same thing about water. So when we talk about water and we talk about fundamentals like water, like food, like a roof over your head. So many of us know that these are what makes for a human life to be a life that one can live without having to feel as if you are being treated like less than a human being. And I don't know how far you want me to go into, we fought very hard in the Detroit case in 2014, but we lost. but then we won some things too. And some of the things that we won is that there was a process set up where a person could go in and make a plan to have a water bill paid over a period of time. Now, right there at that point, it was what we thought was a victory. There was a moratorium for 5 weeks. And then after that, though, it didn't work because there wasn't enough money to share. And there really was not the ability to keep that payment plan current. And so we came right back around to it. So by 2016, 2017, we're back up to 30, 40,000 people in the city every year being cut off. We filed another case, and that's the Taylor case that's presently pending. And in that case, we have now brought in the Fair Housing Act, and we have brought it in under the section of specifically 3604B. And that is that there would not be any implementation, regulation, or discriminating on the basis of race in the terms and conditions or privileges of the provision of services or facilities. Now, that case right now is on hold. The judge has it. Defendants, of course, filed a motion for summary judgment, but a strange thing happened along the way. Everything that we had said, we were prescient to the extent that we said, listen, if you don't have clean, safe, affordable water, and along comes a pandemic, people are going to be in trouble. And in fact, it happened. Detroiters' numbers for COVID just went through the roof. And what the governor immediately came in and said, not only is there not to be any more shutoffs, we must go back and turn on everybody's water. And so we were in a position where we had filed the case, and then we now are, the mayor saying, guess what? We're not going to shut off water anymore. Well, we don't know if that's true or not. We're just not going to believe that until we see it in an ordinance or we see it in some statutory provision. But there must be a way to keep the water flowing for not only Detroiters, for others. And in this first section, I just want to say that Michigan State University in 2017 did a study that said that the issue of safe, clean, affordable water is coming to a neighborhood near you. Just hang around, you're going to see it. It's going to happen because, and what they predicted 5 years ago was that in 5 years, there would be at least 36% or somewhere like that of communities that could no longer afford their water and or the water wouldn't be safe or accessible. So I just want to stop with that for that first portion, Martha.
Thank you, Alice. So let me then turn to my slides, and let me see if I can, we've got a little comment here about the infrastructure bill. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Okay, I can share my screen here. Great. So I want to say a few words now about the national picture. And I've been working with a team in Boston that's conducting research on water policies nationally with funding from the National Science Foundation. And I want to begin by stressing that the sorts of racial equity issues that Alice is working on in Michigan are present nationally. So this is rising water prices, accessibility and quality are an issue for everyone, but some people can afford to, work around it in ways that others can't. And it, maybe not surprisingly, then falls hardest on BIPOC individuals. And there's some really dispiriting information drawn from national census data about this and that is shown on this slide. It was prepared by a doctoral student at Northeastern. And what it shows is that water is more likely to be unaffordable for BIPOC households, and shutoffs are more likely to occur, even accounting for controlling for household income, age, water conservation, and so on. So we're talking about a disparate impact that is, that hinges on race as opposed to other factors that that might affect shutoffs or unaffordability. And sometimes this apparent racial bias, may be unconscious in the sense that it's not overt, and that's what the Michigan Civil Rights Commission generously concluded when it investigated what had happened in Flint, Michigan. You see here, they say we want to believe that nobody specifically considered race and national origin and so on in their decision making, but everyone sees that race likely made a difference, and that if the community affected was a more white community, that the responses would have been different. And so the commission here concluded that the evidence of racial impact was so overwhelming that at the end of the day, it's clear that race played a significant role in the tragedy in Flint. And I'll give you another example of the hidden racial bias in water policies. And I'll say, this is a water policy issues, Alice knows from litigating on this, it's a very technical area. And it's not surprising that, that it hasn't received so much attention for that reason, because it's very difficult to get your mind around some of the decisions that people that are in water administration, utility administration have to make. But here's a slide on the racial housing gap, which of course we were just talking about in the prior session. Overall in the US and in certain cities like Boston and Minneapolis and Albany, which are really at the top of this gap, whites are much more likely than BIPOC people to be homeowners. Yet in these same cities, the customer assistance programs that utilities develop, the water utilities offer, are generally available only to select group of homeowners. It's usually low-income senior homeowners who are eligible for customer assistance plans. And that's a group that's disproportionately white. Renters, of course, consume water and pay for it, but they pay for it typically, unlike electricity, they typically pay for water through their landlords, with payments sometimes that are incorporated into their rent or sometimes appear in a separate bill that they get from their landlord. And if their landlords are not qualified for assistance, if they're not seniors or low income, the renters pay full price for the water without any access to assistance, because the assistance is limited to homeowners. Now, is this racially disparate act, this policy intentional? There's really a practical explanation, right? Renters don't have any direct relationship with the water utility. So it would be difficult for the utility to provide assistance because they don't know who the renters are. And they would have to develop some new program for it. But there are some jurisdictions that have looked at this issue, have recognized the racial impacts that it has, and recognize that it simply perpetuates the racial housing gap, because the people that are not getting the assistance are the lowest income folks and disproportionately BIPOC. And those cities, and it's a very, very small number of them, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas are the ones that I know about, and there are many others that have not done this. But those cities, once they recognize the racial impacts of this issue, have been able to develop programs to reach low-income, disproportionately BIPOC renters by delivering benefits through sharing information with the LIHEAP program, or providing other sorts of subsidies to renters that make up the difference for the water the water assistance that they're not able to get. So I think it's fair to say that the policies in the other cities continue to explicitly favor homeowners, reflect deliberate ignorance and inaction, and a refusal to examine the racial impacts of water policies. And so that's just an example of the kinds of things that are perpetuated because these policies are so intricate, difficult to understand, and sort of, people don't think of it as being a civil rights issue. We call this the deliberate in our team, a research team, we call this the deliberate production of ignorance. And water's utilities' failure to examine the racial impacts of their own policies because they really don't want to know, because it would be difficult to try to redress some of the issues that are created. And I'll venture to say that this represents a management culture that is not uniformly the case, but is often the case within water utilities, where racial equity has simply not been a concern, and where there's been little to no scrutiny of racial impacts until very recently, until we had things happening like the Detroit shutoffs. It's impossible to generalize about all water authorities. I believe there are over 143,000 in the United States. And so that makes study very difficult. It makes generalizations difficult. But a consistent experience of researchers and reporters seeking information from water authorities to look at racial issues is that many water authorities, many utilities simply don't know, haven't even thought about the racial impacts of their policies. And these are some quotes from reports where people were trying to get information so that they could assess racial impacts, and there just was no information available that the utilities could share. They tell us they don't have specialists on hand who have time to engage in proactive analysis. There's no budget for it. Sometimes they actually tell us they don't see any need for the information. There's no need to get disaggregated data or to take a look at the racial impacts. Utilities have told us that while they have aggregate data on shutoffs per year, so they know, the big number, they don't know if the same addresses are being shut off over and over again. They don't know where the shutoffs are occurring. They don't have any data about the customers who have negotiated payment plans over a period of time and where they are living in the community to make some assessments about the racial impacts of those kinds of negotiations, or customers who have been subjected to liens in places that use that mechanism as a way to collect on water debt. They don't really know who those people are, or how many of them, what's the same people over and over again. They just don't have, except for very few of them, they just don't collect that data. And of course, lacking this information makes it very hard to target programs like the customer assistance plans in ways that promote racial equity, because they simply don't know who's being affected. Instead, utilities are developing programs that are well-meaning, that look good, but that they have very little data on who will be impacted and very little to go on how they should be targeted, other than just assumptions. And they can't even evaluate the program's success. And one of the things we've seen is that with these customer assistance plans, there's often a very low rate of take-up of them because they aren't advertised, aren't known by people in the water consumers in the community. However, the reality is that without the capacity to analyze the impacts of various programs, water authorities can never know what is working to promote racial equity or what is exacerbating inequity and injustice. And so what can local governments, and particularly local human rights commissions, do? And the first step is, one of our goals today is to try to get folks to recognize that water is a civil rights and a human rights issue. That's really within the scope of a human rights and a civil rights agenda. It's important to be aware, as Alice mentioned, that discriminatory household water policies violate the Fair Housing Act. And while Alice's case is still pending on that, there have been prior cases that make it clear that that's the case. It's not a legal gray area. It's absolutely the case that water policies of this kind that have a racial impact can come within the scope of the Fair Housing Act. And I know, or I suspect, that many of your commissions deal with Fair Housing Act complaints as well. You may not see water complaints coming across the board, but it's an area that could be if people were aware that the Fair Housing Act was available to remedy some of those things. There's a growing recognition nationwide of the importance of water as a civil rights and human rights issue. For example, excuse me, I'm in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission last year released a report on racial disparities in Massachusetts water policies. The report was approved by the U.S. Civil Rights Commission and is available on the Commission's website. And I'll try to, if I get a chance, put the link in the chat if people want to look at that. This was the first time in the history of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that the commission or its state advisory committees had examined water access as a civil right. But it got the ball rolling, and now Maryland, the state advisory committee in Maryland, is working on a similar report looking at water as a civil rights issue. So recognition is the first step. The second step, I hope, for a local commission is to actually take some action to address the racial inequities in water administration and water utility administration. This is an historic moment for this issue because, as someone mentioned, the infrastructure bill, the new federal funding that is flowing, so to speak, to the water sector. And in particular, once you shine an equity lens on water issues in a community, I urge you to start thinking about how these funds might provide some redress. And let me go to another slide here. The American Rescue Plan funds, which are already being distributed. There was one tranche that went out in the June, I think, of last year, and then there's another tranche that's coming out in about 7 months now, a year from the original tranche. Those funds, plus the funds made available through the new infrastructure bill, can be used to address racial equity in the water sector. ARPA, which of course is already, funds are already out there, is really teed up to address the current knowledge gaps about racial equity if we only raise those issues and make clear that with really not a huge amount of funding, we could have information about what the racial impacts are that would allow for targeted programs and better outcomes in the water sphere. When we talk about water systems and federal assistance, attention naturally turns to the need to repair our nation's water infrastructure, and that's with good reason. The U.S. has a crisis in water infrastructure, and needed repairs and updates will have broad community benefits and will often help reduce overall water and sewer rates everyone community-wide. And inadequate infrastructure, not surprisingly, often has disparate racial impacts, as we'll hear when Alice talks a little bit about Benton Harbor and her work there. But ARPA funds go beyond a limited vision of infrastructure to recognize the role that water utilities play in protecting the public health and to provide needed financial assistance to water consumers who are recovering from COVID and from the debt that they incurred in that context. And specifically, ARPA funds can be used, as you can see in this excerpt from the final rule, to improve the efficacy of economic relief programs, including the assistance programs that utilities have initiated and refined in the context of COVID. So it's an opportunity to improve the data collection capacity of water utilities, to have them prioritize this so that the programs that they create that are well-meaning are actually targeted at the people that need the help. So according to ARPA's interim final rule, these improvements can include the use of data analysis, targeted consumer outreach, improvements to data or technology infrastructure, and impact evaluations, all things that very few, if any, water utilities are currently doing to ensure that their programs are equitable. And there are some great models around the country where some of the larger utilities, and maybe some of you are from these communities, have used GIS mapping and other technology tools to get a much better picture of their customers' needs, results that really are effective in promoting racial justice. And Seattle is a good example of that. The city of Seattle was able to use GIS mapping to help it realize that certain recurring issues like shutoffs or failure to pay were concentrated in racially identified neighborhoods. And having gotten that information, they were able to refine their programs to really reach the targeted population rather than relying on just sort of hunches and assumptions about the impacts of their policies. With the ARPA funding in the picture and the infrastructure funding coming down the pike, this is right now is a really historic opportunity to adopt improvements in data capacity to analysis in the water sector, specifically as a strategy to improve racial equity. And the ability to gather and analyze data and to use it to identify racial justice issues, as well as to identify and constrain implicit bias, as we saw in Flint, is really a key part of identifying evidence-based approaches to water infrastructure and water access. And this is particularly important, as Alice mentioned, because water is a human right. And if need that really should be made, must be made available in a way that promotes racial equity. So I'll stop there. And Alice, did you want to, were you going to add some things about Benton Harbor, or shall we open it up for discussion?
So I'd like to add a few things about legislation. Since 2014, Martha, as you know, the folks in Detroit and the team, we've been working on both statewide legislation, particularly around transparency and collection of data that would give us the ability to call these things out without going through FOIA requests, which can just be nuts. So we're working with Senator Stephanie Chang now, and we're pretty close, and we've got at the table some of the large water providers. And what we want is not only the data on who's being shut off, but we also want pricing and other material, which is going to show us really where we've got the problem. And also the national legislation that's being prepared, which Martha, you reviewed some of the drafts on that along with water expert Coton, Roger Coton, also on the East Coast there with you. And what we are almost there with that national legislation. And so what human rights organizations can do as these legislations are coming down the chute, we can reach out and ask for letters of support and so forth to push that legislation up into the forefront. And not only is there transparency in Michigan, we're working on shut-off protection, affordability is big. I also had a case called Kramer, where they had literally started billing people for any amount they wanted. Like 1 month you get $300, the next month $3, and they were not using the meter at all. And we were able to get 4 years of payment wiped out because they were not following the ordinance. So they always look, if you're working with ordinance issues, these are communities that can be supported. All of the work that we do at our firm comes because a community of people, including the plaintiffs who become parts and stand up for their community in these lawsuits, they create the movement around this. And one of the things that's going on right now in Benton Harbor, it is a very unhuman situation which has been allowed to occur. The state of Michigan's Department of Water, basically, environmental, knew that there was lead exceedances in the water since 2018. Now, lead is pernicious. It will destroy a child's brain. It will hurt a mother's fetus to the point that the child is literally born where the IQ has been diminished somewhat. It will also create in adults and children both kidney, liver, you name it, it causes it difficulties. We found out that they, and this is through, again, community working together to bring this issue to the EPA. The EPA issued a unilateral order. The unilateral order said, you are in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act because you did not tell the community for 3 years that the water you are drinking, that you're cooking with, that you're brushing your teeth with, and other physical needs is poison. And so now we have children that are testing high for lead. We have homes that there is water that cannot be used. They are paying for the water. If they don't pay for the water gets cut off. So this case was recently filed in the Western District. A human rights support for this small community of 10,000. And why could this happen? How could this happen? 85% African American, it is 5% Hispanic. you have a poverty level that's roughly 50%. It is the city that time forgot. And so you have a situation where a governor who's involved with the Flint case, they blew it on this one. And so we are just filing the lawsuit to try to get in there, to get some injunctive relief, to get some relief from these bills, to set up a mechanism by which these children can be evaluated and help given to them now, so that they're not, the issue of aggressiveness that comes with lead intake. And so many children, the hearing is lost, the speech is lost. They have an independent educational plans. We are in there now and a team of lawyers, it's not just me, but it's my firm and another firm. We are trying to do everything we can we can't save this community because they've already got the hit, but we can try to do what we can as lawyers and human rights activists. Like Detroit, when there was the human rights issue presented, there was the ability of the United Nations to come in. UN came in, Leilani Farah for housing, and Katerina de Albuquerque came in for the water rapporteur. We're calling for justice for the citizens of Benton Harbor. You don't know about it, look it up, Google it. It's just tragic, but we're there to try to fight. Support there would be very helpful to the governor's office.
Great, thank you. So, Alice, we've got a couple of questions already in the chat, so I'll go ahead and the first one that I saw was a question of privatization. You know, what's the role of privatization in some of the tragedies and occurrences that we're seeing? And I'll speak from my perspective as a researcher. And as a Massachusetts resident, there is not very much privatization here in Massachusetts. And I know there's more in many other states. Though one instance of privatization that I know in this area, the utility was sold to a private company, and then the city tried to buy it back because they were so unhappy. Their prices went up very soon after the initial sale. So, and I think nationally, the data shows that actually that private doesn't result in better service for communities by and large. But that's not to say that it's not happening. As a researcher, it certainly makes it more difficult to get information about what the policies are, because the Freedom of Information Act or FOIL laws are not available for private entities. And so there isn't the same, there is regulation, obviously, but there's not the same transparency that there is for a government run utility, government owned utility. And so that makes it more difficult to know, to assess whether or not the policies and prices being charged and so on are really having inequitable impacts. So that's the experience that I've had with privatization. Alice, do you want to comment on that?
With the bankruptcy in Detroit, which was where we filed the original LIDA case in the bankruptcy court, strange thing, we found that the powers that be were attempting to bring in Viola, which is one of the water privatized, and we fought back on that. We knew that if this was happening with the public officials who were actually being elected, what, my goodness, could happen if people who were being paid to run the system could happen. And there was and we're very keen on working against having privatization. I know too that there has been attempts at privatization, like you, Martha, that where they had privatization, then they said, no, we don't want this, can we buy it back? So, but I think that is something that human rights organizations and agencies should have their antennas up on. Absolutely.
And then we have another question about Wall Street investors buying up water resources. And that's not something I have very much knowledge of. I mean, I'm sure Alice, you would agree that to the extent that's really in tremendous tension with the idea of water as a common good, as a human right. And so one thing I'll mention that we didn't bring up before is that there, of course, the laws around water, it's very atomized. One of the reasons that this has been such a hard nut to crack nationally is that every state is not every one of these 143,000 utilities that have their own regulations. But California is the only state in the country that has adopted as a matter the idea that there is a human right to water. And that doesn't create an entitlement that you can sue on, but they have implemented it to the extent of requiring assessments of human rights impacts when new water policies are developed. And just before getting on this call, I was looking at a California website where they have mapped water affordability or unaffordability statewide. And so the idea that there's a human right to water as a statutory matter has definitely increased the transparency there in that state. And it's something would be wonderful to see other states or localities, which are can also adopt these kinds of resolutions, adopt that kind of perspective on water that I think would fight against the idea that any private owners can really control access in that way. Alice, do you want to add in there?
Sure. The human right to water, the legislation that we've been working on, Martha, as you know, has as its foundation that even though water is a human right, there's got to be the ability for people to pay what they can afford. So underlying the water as a human right is the need to pay for water at the level, whether it's 2%, 2.5%, but to look at it and specifically to know that it's a parameter that if we don't do this, what we're going to have happening is that people will not be able to afford water. So the person who needs to have their dialysis or at home, or they need to have their feeding tube in, and they get their water cut off, we're going to have some tragedies that are just can be fixed now. So this omnibus water is a human right, civil rights piece of legislation. You may hear about it soon. In conjunction with that, the People's Water Board and the National Coalition on Legislation for Affordable Water is rolling out a film that has different locations around the country. The Navajo Nation, for instance, where over 40%, 50% of its citizens have to go someplace else and drive to get their water and pump it like we're back in, the 1800s or something. And also Philadelphia, the best, the shining star that we have, as well as Detroit, Iowa, and also down in Alabama, and the whole issue of septic tanks and how that bodily waste are seeping up out of the ground. Catherine Flowers, a very different, just got a Genius Award, MacArthur, a Genius Award for her work on septic water tanks down there in the South. And these are issues that human rights agencies, as you hear about them, as you see them, it's involved. They will be at the grassroots level. They'll be very close to the ground. But if you are working in community, or you're from community, as I am, I'm from the east side of Detroit, so I've never really left. So I'm still kind of there and tucked into people, involved with people in the community. So you've got to be able to talk with the community that's involved at a level where when you say, how about hopping on this lawsuit and getting involved, or how about coming to this meeting where we're going to be fighting for transparency, that really helps.
Great, thanks. I'll just
Okay.
say, Alice mentioned Philadelphia, and people may know that Philadelphia and soon, I believe, Baltimore are two cities that have adopted a different kind of approach to water pricing. And we talked earlier, I mentioned customer assistance plans, and Philadelphia has a customer affordability plan, which means that the amount that you pay is key to your income, and it has more tiers than what a customer assistance plan would have. And then also provides a more generous opportunities for paying back bills and so on, where if you comply, are able to keep up with your payments, eventually your debt will be erased. So there are a number of features of that that are, as Alice mentioned, it's kind of a model program in the United States of something that is more sensitive to the needs of individuals for access to water and access to affordable water. So Alice, we have a question here about the fact patterns of Fair Housing Act cases. And I thought maybe you could field that one to start.
Well, with the fair housing case that we filed, we kind of merged that in with the public health crisis that was presented by the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic that we're still in. And one of the things we did is we went to the University of Michigan. We had gotten involved with a statistician there to review the census data as well as the track data. And there was a statistical analysis done that showed that in the African-American neighborhoods, the water shutoffs, even with all things being equal, the multiple variant review of it showed that there was an impact statistically in these communities. So we had to have, and we presented in our motion for SD, a statistical pattern. We also utilized a medical doctor, Dr. Michael Herbert, who is both an internist as well as an epidemiologist, who has been involved in issues of waterborne disease. And a lot of his work was done in Africa, but he's here in Michigan. And he did an affidavit, again, the expert witness, someone who can say, without water, without clean, affordable water, that washing of the hands, what you're doing is setting up any community for even more. I mean, even before COVID came along, there were other waterborne type conditions that were happening to community. There was an uptick that we were able to show. And then also Dr. Herbert talked about the fact that you have all kind of medical conditions where there is a dehydration that has occurred in the human body, and it will accelerate that medical condition where whether it's diabetes or hypertension. Not having the adequate amount of water will do that. And getting bottled water and you're paying for it and you have no money, so you're just drinking a little bit of water out of a little bitty bottle, is not going to hydrate the body. So all of that, yes, is part of putting together factually these cases, and then having the plaintiffs who speak to each segmentation of the case. I think that's it.
Great, thank you. So, so I'll just, hearing your discussion, your expert witness testimony just reminded me of some research that we did in Chelsea, which is a low-income neighborhood in Boston, where we were interviewing people about water affordability and found that people would forego taking medicine that required water, because they wanted to conserve water. They wouldn't garden, even though that would be a source of healthy food because they were concerned about watering the garden, because of the cost of that. So it definitely has an impact on, people's everyday lives and health. So in terms of fact patterns, I thought I'd mention probably the most well-known case involving the Fair Housing Act and water was out of Zanesville, Ohio, where there was an entire neighborhood just on the other side of the tracks or on the side of the road where the water utility, the city, made a decision not to pipe in running water. And so people for many years relied on cisterns and wells and things like that. And even though they were, easily within proximity of the rest of the city and piping could have been run there, the city just didn't do it. And finally, they filed a lawsuit, and I think in the context of discovery, determined that actually there had been some statements and remarks that indicated that it was because of race, that it was because this neighborhood was primarily BIPOC, that the city had refused to extend the pipes in that way. That case ultimately, there was a motion to dismiss, it wasn't dismissed, and then it was settled after that. So there wasn't a ruling kind of spelling out how the Fair Housing Act was violated, but the fact that it went past a motion to dismiss indicated that the Fair Housing Act claim was a viable claim. And so that's, probably the lawsuit that's best known in this area. I was going to mention also, Alice, you talked about your working with expert witnesses, people from the universities, from Michigan State in particular, which is well known for this work on water. But there are lots of researchers around the country that are working in this area. And so I would really, if you're interested in this, folks at commissions, I would really encourage you to try to reach out and get a sense of who in your local universities is researching water issues. As I mentioned, my university has a National Science Foundation grant to look at water affordability. So, the fact that there's funding available means that more and more researchers are spending time on this and are doing, we're looking at this because of our concerns about, racial implications and the implications for low income people. And so I think that there'd probably be a lot of interest in helping and working in partnership with human rights commissions. That kind of partnership is important because this is such a technical area. It's difficult to crack without a lot of technical background. And so in my research, we work with sociologists, but we also work with engineers, because it is a technical place. So Alice, somebody put in the chat a question, not a question, but a statement about personal accountability, and hoping that there might be some personal accountability for some of the results of shutoffs, but also of the tainted water in Benton Harbor. And I know, of course, in Flint, there was a lot of publicity about the culpability of the people that were involved. What kind of comments do you have about the potential or the appropriateness of personal accountability in these areas?
Well, unfortunately, I was not involved in the Flint case. So what I understand, though, is that all the charges, with the exception of a few of the minor pleas, were dismissed. So far, Governor Snyder has not been indicted on anything. He had previously been indicted. So this Benton Harbor situation is so fresh. I mean, literally in September, the end of November 2nd, I think we filed the complaint within a week or so after the order came down. So we're just teasing it out, but there looks to be plenty of culpability. We know now that there are little kids that were born, and the plaintiffs in the case, we have at least 10 or 15 babies that were born since 2018 who were nursed with bottles of formula with this water. and the impact on them. We have also, one of the named plaintiffs it's a child that they just reduced the lead level. No bit of lead is safe, but they just reduced it from 5 parts to 3.5 parts. And one of the children, we just got news a couple days ago, has a 4.5. And he is already showing signs of hyperactivity and inability to follow directions, the whole syndrome that comes with hyperactivity. So, we just don't know where this is going to lead and whether or not even anyone died as a result of lead. We know there have been hospitalizations for sure.
Well, it's very sad.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any other questions pending right now. So I want to go back to that poll that we did at the beginning of this, where there were some people who said our commission has not thought about this at all. And then a handful of people said, yes, we have thought about water and racial equity issues. And I wonder if some of the folks that answered that poll might be able to tell us a little bit more about what you've done in the area, or what, whether you've considered it and haven't been able to put it on the agenda. We'd be very interested in hearing about your experiences. You can put in the chat, or I think if you raise your hand, I think I can call on people too. Anyone willing to share?
Martha, I'll go ahead and just jump in here. I hope the other
Thank you.
folks step up, but I just want to say that we're in a very early part of that process. We're doing the strategic planning process in Los Angeles County. We know that there have been a number of cases where the environmental equity issues have come up in our county, and which is a vast county with 88 different cities. I don't know how many utilities honestly exist, but we know that even in parts of the neighborhoods where I've lived, that there's been an issue of chromium-6 contamination from all the heavy metal processing that was going on. And I think that was made famous in Aaron Brockovich, the movie, at one point. But that's still in a lot of the groundwater. And there's a lot of, I think a lot of questions about the safety of water in different communities and how it varies based on the racial composition, right, of those communities and the wealth. So that's an area where we plan to really push our county Department of Public Works, which serves the 1.6 million people in LA County that are unincorporated, that basically LA County government is their municipal government, and to start to collect that data that needs to be collected to even know what the impacts are. We think that's, an area where the minimum we can do is to call attention to it, push our county departments to collect that data, invite communities to raise concerns about that, so we can hear about any complaints, any stories, and utilize that to really push forward better data collection and transparency, so we can see what's happening in these different utilities. I think it's great hearing both of you talk about the experiences you've had. It gives ideas about legal pathways, civil rights authority that we can lean on, challenges of it. But I do think there's a fundamental role for government and our agencies to at least ask the questions, right? I think that's the start, just asking the questions. And then there are other agencies which have the responsibility to answer those questions. And if put in the context of Fair Housing Act, in the context of the American Recovery Plan Act, final interim rule, those are all both on one side the legal authority to ask those questions and the resources for them to tap to be able to get the answers to those questions. So I think this is a great step forward for us as a community in broadening our thinking about this, and having, thanks to you both, very specific tools and strategies for how we can start the process in our communities.
So Robin, I do have a question. As we saw from that poll, it looks like not very many human rights commissions have looked at this issue so much. It sounds like you all are at least looking at it in the preliminary stage. Have you felt, does the fact that California has a human right to water statute, did that kind of create a culture that supports your investigation of this, or was it something else that caused you to feel like this should be on the agenda?
Well, I think that helps. There's no question that helps. And as you pointed out, it's more declaratory than it has actual, a mechanism for enforcement. But it does help that the state recognizes it. I think what's really important is just tracking the news and the stories that are coming out and really reaching out to community to hear about these issues. I think that's where the jurisdictions start to realize this is something we need to do something about, when there are actual cases of individuals who are not getting access to water, are finding the water to be contaminated, and that and other environmental issues of we have a lot of refineries in our area, and so there's been issues of a lot of air quality issues for entire communities who've been in the pathway, as well as methane gas leaks and things like that. So just the whole issue of environmental justice and equity is, I think, opening up. And I think water is such a fundamental need for every human being. And I think for a long time now, people have just been relying on switching to bottled water, right, as an alternative to when they think their water isn't safe. And we know that bottled water doesn't have to meet any standard higher than just what comes out of your tap. And so the quality of that, and the fact that you're, of course, denying certain communities with lesser means to be able to pay for bottled water, it changes the whole dynamic, right? And I think there's an interesting play there about how the whole bottled water movement has, in a sense, allowed utilities to get less pressure to provide publicly available water to everyone that's healthy and clean. And at the same time, I think even raises some questions about, we're basically privileging certain communities with the financial means to access water, clean water, right, high quality water, while exposing poorer communities to less secure water.
Yeah. Thank you, Robin. We have a question here or a comment from Frederick Sykes. I see your hand up.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for responding to my raised hand. Just to add to what the Executive Director, Robin Toma, was speaking about, on the eastern side of LA County, for instance, I live in what's called San Gabriel Valley. And at one time, we were really called the Valley of the Dumps, because we have so many dumps in our community. And the most recent one that you can read about is just Google the Pico Rivera Water District. They have just received a grant, and we're dealing with these what's called forever chemicals. And so our household waste, where you drop everything, carpet, and things like that, that's where those chemicals generate from. And so these are just one of the type of the issues that we're dealing with right now today. So if you just Google that, Pico Rivera, they got a grant for 4.3 million to help them clean up their water supply for their community. And again, that's called the Pico Rivera Water District. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Alice, do you have any comment on that? You do a lot of environmental.
Yes, a couple of things. In Michigan, PFAS, which is called the forever chemical, has become an issue, especially as we go further north. And it's certainly an issue also in the Detroit area. So that is a chemical that everyone, again, should be on the lookout for, the PFAS, because it does extreme harm to the human body. I did want to say about transparency and California's whole of government approach, which is that every agency has to think about how that water how water affects that particular part of the agency. With the legislation that we're working on with Senator Stephanie Chang at the state level, one of the issues is creating a portal that will house this information that the water companies can go straight into and put their data in it. And so what we're looking at is the initial startup cost may be as much as $2 or $3 million. So to the extent that human rights agencies are involved in having requesting to craft these type of portals that will house information, it's going to cost some money. Now, there is some money floating around now. How long that's going to last, I don't know, but we've got to take advantage of that. So if you're working on water, you're working on housing, it is probably an opportunity now to start at your state level, rather, to look at that. And we've also, in the Transparency National Bill, also have a transparency issue for locating information into a portal. All of these things are technical, so, and how much they will cost, we don't know, but they're certainly needed to fairly consider each and every community for their water affordability issues.
Great, thank you. So I'm not sure Robin or Diane who I should be talking to. We've got a couple of hands up here, but I know they're also coming to the end of our time. So do we have time for one more comment or question, or?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Anthony White.
Okay, thank you.
And pleasure to meet you, Martha and Alice. And Alice, I am a fellow Detroiter also. I grew up in the city of Highland Park.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask, and I don't know if anyone else has mentioned it, but the elephant in the room for me is the EPA. Where are they on this?
Well, on the whole issue, we know with Benton Harbor, for instance, and with the Flint, we know that they had certain knowledge and did not act. And so part of this whole process is getting government to do what government is supposed to do. And EPA, unfortunately, in too many instances, has not been alert to, even when they see the evidence right hitting their desk, they have not moved on it. And it's really hidden in a lot of ways. They just take it and toss it into the pile. And so unless and until that community activates itself and forces the EPA to do what needs to be done, which is then what happened in Benton Harbor, a petition was done by the community. Nothing, everybody sleep at the wheel. I think it's criminal, by the way.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Now, would you attribute that to, in some part, to the defunding perhaps of the EPA to an extent?
It's hard for me to say, but I really think that it's funding, but it's also, you got to be tuned in. You got to care about the people that you're representing. And if you're not caring about little kids whose brains are being damaged by lead, then you need to look for another job. I'm sorry.
Yeah, because I read recently, there was an article, this was some time ago, that the company Nestle, they were drawing a lot of the water from Lake Michigan, and they were using that for their production of bottled water. And we have corporations that can get whatever they want when they need it, but something as simple as drinking water, the average citizen is being overlooked here.
Yeah, dear friend Jim Olson has been fighting the Nestle struggle fight legally and organizationally for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And there was just recently, Nestle just got dialed down. I mean, they were getting huge amounts. The water was literally dropping from where they were pulling their water. And so But even still, they still have a free access to it, to the point where they're not paying what they should. Well, they shouldn't be doing it. There
Right.
in Michigan, there is a public trust on the issue of water, which Jim has argued for years. So I think that that's another issue where the community must enforce its public trust. It's almost like a treaty. It is a treaty with the people that the water will be used for the people, not for Nestle's to come in and get as much as they want and then sell the same water to you for probably 10 times.
Right.
What-
Right.
So I'll just add that with the EPA does not regulate water affordability. So
Yeah.
so that's another thing, is that's really at the local level. I know that we need to wrap up. Mr. Stowe, you had your hand up, so maybe you want to make a quick closing comment.
Yes, thank you so much, Martha, and then Alice, thank you so much.
Thank you.
One of my colleagues, Cassandra, has put her sort of finger on the question I'm going to ask. One is about those of us who are small agencies and don't have the, in her word, bandwidth to engage in some of these, quote, non-traditional issues that many of us have been dealing with. Can you say a quick word about possible partnerships? And then the other thing quickly is that if we want to get involved in some of these issues that are not traditionally ones we have dealt with, you know, not the discrimination cases as an example, and those kinds of things, how do we begin the process? How do I go out, for instance, in my own utility, and, you know, they've never seen me before on this particular piece, right? How do I begin the process? How do I sort of lay the groundwork, if you will, that allows me to start the process of looking at these issues? How do I ask the first questions to get to a point of being able then to say, you know, what are you doing here, Jim? So, well, I need to know about pricing, for example. I need to know about the percentage of shutoffs as an example. How do I start that process?
You just started a whole new workshop.
Okay. Okay.
So I would just say there are people out there we're actually over our time, but you know, Martha and I both are available if you want to reach out. I would say first though, just look around your community. Somebody's doing some water work, some grassroots community organization, some religious organization is taking this issue up. And so that's where you start really. And then to reach out to others who have probably gone, Michigan Welfare Rights and the People's Water Board Coalition. They are really good resources for organizations or people who want to get working on this issue in a way that's maximizing the work.
So it's great to end with demand for another workshop on this.
Right.
So
We're going to make sure that's
thank you, everyone. And I know we've got an exciting next session that's waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alice, too.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. See you.
Thank you so much, Martha Davis and Alice Jennings. That was a wonderful panel that has opened up a whole new arena. We do hope to have in our next conference that next workshop that Alice just referred to. So, you know, keep your calendar cleared for August in Los Angeles. We'd love to go deeper into this.